Yep.
Every time in my life I tried a Vox amp, I played around with it, I liked it, but I never felt really at home. Not that I did with other amps. If I was forced to play with a Vox AC30 during a gig, I could do so, but I wouldn't be like 100% happy. I would be happier with a deluxe reverb or with or maybe a Plexi Marshall. Somehow that's more my cheese than the Vox amp is. And although all of that is my reality with Vox amps, and I've had experiences with Vox amps on different levels, I acknowledge that those amps have created, in combination with the corresponding artist, obviously, have created some of the most iconic tones in the history of guitar tones. I mean, we just have to look at people like Brian May or The Shadows. The Shadows played Vox amps up to when I saw the Foo Fighters in a very small venue. That's a long time ago. I was one of 500 people in that venue that saw the Foo Fighters. Two years later, they sold out Wembley. And Dave Grohl was playing a Vox AC30 blended with a dual rectifier, an early two-channel dual rectifier. And that sound was crushing. That was the first time I was like, okay, there is something about Vox amps, because in a way, they sound very musical. They sound very pleasing to a band context. So that's my opening statement. That's where I am on the spectrum. Where are you?
That's a very fair assessment, because I'm going to share with you kind of my experience. So
please.
The YouTube channel that I have mainly started with Vox content, just because of the fact that a lot of people misunderstand these amps. We have to acknowledge that for some players, these amps are not going to be for them, right? Tonally speaking, the interaction they have with them, it's not going to be their thing. And that, to me, is fair enough. You know, if you buy an amp, you watch videos on YouTube, people tell you what to do, you try it, you go, nah, this is not my gig. That is fine. But sometimes I manage to give enough information to people about, you know, something like the AC50 behind me, or an AC4, the AC15, AC10. And then they go, wait a minute. Okay, so these amps don't necessarily react the same way as something like a Fender or a Marshall. Because a Marshall, I mean, even a Marshall can be really tough to dial in. Like if you're using, like, let's say a JCM 800 at home, and you're like, I want to sound like one of my favorite artists, forget about it. At bedroom level, these amps do not perform. And a Vox kind of does the same thing too.
Yeah.
Now, my stance on it is that I've played for most of my life Fender style amps, and they don't sound very good with my playing for whatever reason. So I had a 65 Super Reverb. I had a Tremolux. I had an old Vibrolux. I mean, I had a bunch of amps. And all of them from like early 60s to mid 60s, some CBS stuff. And my dad loved those amps, but for me, I just sounded like completely like bad through those amps. So I went with PV 5150s in my 20s, Angle. I tried Mesa, and those, like, Mesa Boogie is the closest thing that I've found where I was comfortable. I know a lot of people were saying, "Oh, Mesas, they're crap. I don't like them." So I end up being one of the weirdos who really likes those type of amps that are not super popular for whatever reason. But like the F30, the F50 series from Mesa.
Oh yeah,
I freaking love those amps. They sound awesome. Very underrated. And eventually, I think I would say around like 2004, 2005, I heard Brad Paisley for the first time, and I was like, what the hell is he playing through? It sounds killer. So then I started doing some research, and I found out that he was playing a Telecaster through, I think it was like a mid-60s AC30. I was like, okay. And then I got to discover more about the AC30, and I wanted an AC30. But those are big amps. They're loud, they're heavy, and for home use, maybe not the best thing. But the moment I grabbed a Telecaster, plugged into a Vox amplifier, I was like, that's it. That's the sound that inspires me. I like what I hear. So I think it really starts with using the right guitar with those amps. Like if you go with a Strat, I like the sound of a Strat through a Vox, but some people will much prefer the sound of a Strat through a Fender. But then you use a Telecaster through a Vox, things open up. You use a Gretsch through a Vox, things open up. So it seems like a guitar that doesn't have a whole lot of output sounds really great through these amps. But as soon as you get with humbuckers, it tends to sound a bit muddy. So if you're more of a rock player and you go through these amps, some people can pull it off and some people like that sound. But I find most people that love the Vox, per the question, what is it about Vox? They usually attract people that love low output humbuckers or single coils. Those are like the guitars you see the most used with these types of amps. And I think that you also have to be someone that is not into like big, lush, full sounding amplifiers, because they're pretty narrow bandwidth when you think about it. They barely have any low end. They don't have much in the way of low mids, and everything is upper mids and high frequencies with these amps, which explains like the chime part of a Vox. So if you're playing that at home, you go, it sounds filtered, you might not be into it, but then you crank it up, you put it in a band context, and you go, oh, wait a minute. Now I've got this little niche carved out for me by this amp. It sounds mix ready, and it's perfect for live or even the studio, but on its own, that's where I think a lot of people have a hard time. They want it to sound fuller, kind of like a nice cranked Marshall or a good Fender clean tone. So that's kind of like the simplest way I can describe what it is about a Vox amplifier.
Okay. The thing you explained about the low end comes in at a surprise for me, because we know that guys like Brian May used a treble booster to actually bring the amp into, like the next possible kind of distortion range. But then again, you say they don't have a lot of low end. I assume if I was to use a full range boost on a Vox AC30, things would become very muddy very soon.
Well, I think that's where we have to make a distinction between old Vox amplifiers and the new Vox amplifiers. So the old Vox were meant to be like clean headroom type of amps. They were loud, but they did not distort so well. And the treble booster was invented because if you took an AC30 and you cranked it up, it got muddy very, very quickly.
Okay.
So by using the treble booster, you're getting rid of some of the low end and you were boosting up the top end. Okay. Now, if you use today's like Vox made by Korg and you use a treble booster, you might not like the tone as much as what Rory Gallagher was getting or Brian May. Those guys had much darker sounding amps.
Okay.
Today's Vox has a treble bleed on the tone cap there. So as you, not the tone cap, but the volume. So as you crank it up, the treble starts to bleed off. Mm-hmm. But at bedroom level, it's a bright sounding amp. Yeah. So if you think of those amps and then you use a treble booster with them, yeah, it's a bit hard.
Okay. So that has to do with the fact that I'm appreciating that I'm going to learn something on the run here. It essentially has to do with the way these amps were built in the past. Why don't we jump into, I've kind of went into a little bit of history and created some kind of timeline so that people who are not aware of like when and how Vox amps started are like on the same information level. So essentially Vox amp was founded in 1957 by Thomas Walter Jennings. But his first product, which was actually not an amp, it was actually an electronic keyboard, wasn't an amp. So that's what his first thing was. But the whole thing didn't start there. It actually started a little bit earlier when a friend of, or let's not say a friend, what I found was a World War II workmate of him called Dick Denny. He showed him a prototype guitar amp, which would then later become the Vox AC-15. And, World War II workmate sounds more like they were like on the engineering side of things and not so much like running around with a rifle shooting Nazis, you know? So 1957 Vox amp was founded. They released the AC-15 as kind of the first product. And then at the end of the 50s, they also released a student model called the AC-10, which later has been reintroduced. It also had a built-in tremolo effect, although they kind of mislabeled it with vibrato, interestingly. That one was then discontinued in the mid-60s. We are going to find out why in a little bit. So in that same year, 1959, they already were in competition with Fender, but Fender had one advantage back then. They had the Twin. Twin was way more powerful, had more headroom. So we mentioned the Shadows before. The Shadows came in. They were using Vox exclusively, and they said, we want an amp that has more headroom. It needs to be louder. So essentially what they did, they doubled the AC-15 and then kind of created the legendary AC-30, like with 2 speakers and twice the power. And then throughout the 60s, it was made absolutely popular by the Beatles, the Stones, the Kings, the Yardbirds. And I mean, we know about all these players that until today are like known for using the amps. We mentioned Brian May, we have The Edge, Paul Weller, Rory Gallagher, Mark Knopfler, Hank Marvin, Tom Petty. So the list goes on and on and on. It's like so many people who use the amp.
Yep.
And then in the 60s, the Beatles started to use the amps exclusively as well. And when they started touring, they were like, okay, that's nice, but we need more power. It's just not loud enough. I mean, we know about the old videos of the Beatles, and they couldn't hear their own sound because everybody was like screaming so much. And
that's right.
You know, PA systems weren't really a thing back then. So they came out with the AC-50, which you recently found one, and I know you love it very much. They came out with the AC-100, like doubled that even more, which had a 2x15 cab. And then they also made the first sort of hybrid solid state amp called the T60, which wasn't very popular because it tended to overheat. And there we run into something that I am very familiar with when it comes to Vox amps. I always found that whenever I was playing through a Vox and I had it even at half the volume, this amp would get so friggin' hot. Unbelievable. I thought, like, if I put a pan there, I could boil some eggs instantly if I wanted to. It was so hot. And it seems like that was something that until this day, it's inherent. So these amps still tend to get very, very hot because the power amp has been run at extreme voltage to achieve the sound. But also, it got them into a bad reputation in the 60s, where people were like, you know, the amp's overheating or it was malfunctioning. And then, so in the mid-60s, Jennings started a relationship with the Thomas Organ Company in the US. They started to import Vox. And that's where the focus shifted towards transistors. And since that was a big thing, but it also required a lot of investment, Jennings sold his controlling interest of JMI to a British holding company called the Royston Group. He remained a CEO, but he lost all the controlling interest. And then at the end of the 60s, Royston filed for bankruptcy, and that's when something that you mentioned at the end of the last episode, like the ownership of Vox changed during the 70s, like so much.
Yeah.
There was a British bank being an owner. There was Dallas Arbiter, who was one of the owners. The AC30 was continued, but the costs were cut here and there. They started to use PCBs. They started to use solid state rectifiers. They started to use cheaper cabinet material, all that stuff, which kind of confirms my experience with Vox amps. When I started out working in retail, we had a workshop upstairs with a guy who was like, he knew every amplifier inside out. This guy was a genius. An older guy, smoking his pipe, super chilled, relaxed dude. And then he would get in an occasional Fender Twin or something for a modification or for a speaker swap or whatever. But the amplifier that they brought him the most was the Vox AC30, because something was malfunctioning, something was wrong. It was like, he had so many of them, and he said, if you put 20 Vox amps from 1960 to 1980, they're all going to sound they're all going to sound different, and B, they're all going to have different issues.
For sure. Yep. Well, one thing I can say is that I remember reading about Matchless.
Yeah.
And Matchless was started because a lot of musicians back in the 1990s were playing the old Vox amps because they could buy them. They were still pretty affordable.
Yeah.
But they would go on tour and the amps would start to fail on them. So they would come into the shop. They would bring their amps. Can you fix it? I'm on tour. I really need this amplifier. It's the only one I have. So these guys started to analyze the circuit, and they noticed what made it sound great, but they noticed what didn't make sense about these amps and why they were so unreliable. So they started to make their own versions, if you will, of those coveted amps, but they made them like 1,000 times more reliable. And some would even argue that some of the Matchless stuff sounds as good as the vintage amps, maybe even better. So, and then we have kind of a branch off of Matchless with Bad Cat, which also kind of kept that lineage. So you have some boutique options that are more reliable than the vintage stuff, sound just as great, if not better, depending on the person. So yeah, there were some flaws, but we have to keep in mind that they were still a small company and they were trying to reach the American audience. So that's where Thomas Organ comes in. And Thomas Organ really, I'm going to say it, they really shat the bed on this one because they were making their own amps and they were making a lot of solid state amps. They were making this whole line of amps like the Berkeley and, they had all these British sounding names for the amps. But those amps weren't made by Vox in the UK. They were made by Thomas Organ in the United States. And they were like really cheap knockoff. And they even had like pictures of the Beatles in association with amps they never played. So the original Vox company got screwed over by Thomas Organ in a sense. And you mentioned Royce. How are they called?
Royston? The Royston Group was exactly.
That is another company that actually was the downfall of Vox because these guys, they were working on the black box. Okay, so there were many companies working on the black box for aviation, and these guys were sure that they were going to get the government contract. So they were buying all these small companies just to have different assets, and they didn't get the contract.
Yeah.
And when that happened, everything failed for them. They filed for bankruptcy, and part of that bankruptcy was Vox.
Yeah.
So Vox got shafted once again. So it happened on multiple fronts, and I think it was because it was a brand new industry. Because when you think about it, 1950s to 60s, that's not a very long time for guitar to bloom and become this new thing, right? Because before that, it was organs and accordions.
Yeah.